Just imagine what it must have looked like when the queen was buried alive. The sky above the castle had turned an unnatural shade of grey, thick clouds coiling like restless serpents over the stone towers. The wind howled through the corridors, carrying with it the faint creak of chains and the distant clatter of guards' armour. Every echo seemed to amplify the terror that was about to unfold beneath the castle's cold, ancient floors. The queen, young and proud, had never imagined that her life, filled with ceremonial splendour and whispered reverence, would end beneath the earth itself, not at the hands of a rebellious rival, nor as a punishment from the people she ruled, but through the weight of her own missteps. Each decision she had made, each calculated move in the shadows of power, had built a path that led her to this unimaginable fate. As the men lowered her into the pit, the walls of stone casting harsh shadows across her face, the world seemed to shrink. She could feel the chill of the earth pressing closer, the soil that would seal her fate brushing against her skin. The scent of damp stone and rich loamy earth filled her nostrils, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Every breath was shallow, stolen, precious. Yet no matter how she struggled, the cold fingers of inevitability pulled her deeper. Outside the pit, the castle was silent. Courtiers whispered behind velvet curtains, their faces pale but inquisitive, hearts pounding at a spectacle they were forbidden to fully witness. The king had long since departed, leaving his ministers to carry out decrees made in haste and whispered in confidence. And yet, the truth, the unbearable truth, was not entirely theirs to bear. The queen herself had paved the road to her own demise, unaware of the fatal chain she had unleashed with her ambition, her pride, and her mistakes. Every detail of that final moment seemed etched into the fabric of time. The stones around the grave shimmered faintly in the pale light that filtered through cracks in the walls, casting eerie shapes over the queen's pallid features. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected not only the terror of the present, but the weight of every choice that had led here. This was not a fate handed down by enemies alone. It was the reckoning of a mind that had underestimated the relentless gravity of consequence. The soil began to fill the pit, inch by inch, swallowing her world and her past alike. Memories of her life, lavish gowns, crowded banquet halls, the whispered flattery of nobles, flickered in her mind like fleeting shadows. Every privilege she had enjoyed, every manipulation she had attempted, had become another stone in the foundation of her tomb. It was ironic, cruel, and almost poetic. The very tools that had allowed her to climb so high were now the instruments of her downfall. Above ground, the wind carried a murmur of the kingdom's obliviousness. Life continued as if nothing had changed, yet below, the queen confronted the harsh truth of mortality and responsibility. Fear and regret collided in a storm of internal terror as the weight of her choices pressed against her chest, heavier than the soil ever could. In those fleeting moments between the first handfuls of dirt and the last, she understood that tragedy is rarely born of circumstance alone. It is often conceived in the quiet errors of one's own hands. And then came the silence, not the peaceful kind, but a suffocating, absolute void. The darkness enveloped her completely, the walls of her earthen cage pressing close. Time itself seemed to halt, leaving only the echo of what had been, and the shadow of what would never be. The castle above remained unchanged, unaware that the very life that had once dazzled it now rested beneath the cold, unyielding ground. Yet, even in that darkness, the story was not simply one of punishment. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of power, the peril of pride, and the haunting consequences of choices made in ignorance. For centuries, historians would speculate, narrators would embellish, but the core truth would remain. Her fate had been sealed, not by enemies, but by herself. And as the soil settled, covering every trace of her struggle, the kingdom carried on, blind to the drama beneath its feet. But those who truly ponder the story, those who dare to imagine the weight of the earth pressing down, the the cold closing in, the final moments of a life unraveling from within, will never forget the queen who was buried alive, nor the haunting lesson her life and death left behind. For in the end, power and ambition can elevate, but they can also entomb, and one must always ask, if she had chosen differently, could history itself have been rewritten? Or was some tragedy's weight too great to escape, no matter the hands that held them? The kingdom sprawled across rolling hills and shadowed forests, its borders traced by rivers that shimmered like molten silver under the pale, shifting light of dawn. Castles, once proud and unyielding, rose from the earth like silent monuments to a time when power was carved from stone and blood alike. Each stone of these fortresses bore the memory of generations, rulers who had claimed thrones through cunning, alliances stitched together with steel and secrets, and rebellions crushed before they ever whispered across the countryside. Villages dotted the valleys below, cobbled together with timber and straw, where life was a delicate balance between toil and survival, obedience and rebellion, and where even the simplest human endeavor was shadowed by the looming presence of authority that extended from the capital like an invisible hand. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation and the scent of history, a mixture of smoke from hearth fires, damp earth after rain, and the faint metallic tang of iron that hinted at the countless battles fought in service to crown and king alike. Roads wound like arteries through the kingdom, connecting these settlements to the central seat of power, carrying merchants, soldiers, and travelers whose footsteps, though quiet and unnoticed by many, were recorded in the memory of the land itself. In the heart of this kingdom stood the castle, a sprawling labyrinth of stone towers, shadowed corridors, and courtyards where the weight of authority was felt in every corner. The queen, a child of noble blood and high expectation, grew up under the vigilant eyes of tutors and courtiers, her days filled with lessons in etiquette, history, and the subtle art of influence. From the earliest age, she learned that survival in such a realm demanded more than mere obedience. It demanded insight, calculation, and an unflinching awareness of the intentions of those around her. Every glance, every whispered word, every gesture was scrutinized, catalogued, and remembered. And she quickly understood that what was tolerated one day could be condemned the next. She watched, learned, and adapted, practicing the delicate dance of power that would one day determine her fate. The castle was not merely a home, it was a microcosm of the kingdom, where alliances shifted like sand. Loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold, and ambition could be both a shield and a weapon. Outside the stone walls, the world reflected both splendor and decay. Market squares teemed with life, merchants calling their wares with voices that carried over the murmur of a populace whose daily struggles went largely unnoticed by those ensconced in the luxuries of the court. Children darted through narrow streets, barefoot and untamed, their laughter mingling with the cries of animals and the clang of blacksmiths' hammers. Nobles rode through these streets on horseback, their polished armor glinting in the sun, reminding all who saw them that power was visible and unyielding, and that the fate of the common folk was often nothing more than a passing thought. In these streets, the seeds of rebellion and resentment quietly took root, unnoticed by the lords and ladies who held dominion over the land, who moved through life cushioned by wealth and influence, their focus directed towards ceremonies, politics, and the endless games of status that defined their existence. Within the castle, the queen's early life was regimented, controlled, and steeped in lessons that emphasized duty over desire, loyalty over love, and the necessity of foresight in a world governed by tradition and fear. Tutors drilled her in the histories of rulers past, recounting tales of kings who had risen and fallen, of queens whose ambitions had outstripped their wisdom, of revolts crushed beneath the heel of justice that was often swift and merciless. She learned of treaties and betrayals, of the delicate web of alliances that could be undone by a single misstep, and of the power that words, gestures, and appearances held in a realm where perception could determine life or death. Every day, reinforced the lesson that while she might occupy a throne in name, the true seat of power was held by those who could manipulate, coerce, and anticipate the desires and fears of others, and that even the slightest lapse in judgment could unravel years of careful preparation. Even within the safe confines of her private chambers, the young queen felt the presence of observation. Shadows seemed to move with purpose along the tapestries and carved stone, as if the castle itself was alive, recording her choices, noting her movements, and waiting silently for the day when those choices would demand a reckoning. Courtiers, ostensibly loyal, monitored her interactions. The servants whispered what they overheard to ears that would repeat only to those who could use it, and advisors silently plotted while offering counsel that was never as benevolent as it appeared. It was a world where knowledge was power, and where ignorance could be fatal, and the queen, though perceptive, could not yet perceive the full weight of the machinery in motion around her. Her education, though rigorous, left gaps where ambition and naivety intersected. She had been taught to strategize, to foresee consequences, and to navigate the treacherous currents of court life. Yet the complexity of human desire and envy could never be fully predicted. Every smile, every bow, every token of respect carried with it a hidden calculus, a risk of misinterpretation that could set off chains of events with consequences far beyond her control. Or perhaps, consequences she could have avoided had she acted with more care and restraint. The castle, the kingdom, and even the very air she breathed seemed imbued with a silent insistence that every action mattered, every choice weighed against the scales of history, and that the life she assumed she was destined to lead could be overturned by the quietest of missteps. Beneath the veneer of opulence and order, cracks ran deep in both the court and the kingdom. Rivalries between nobles simmered with the intensity of a slow-burning fire, each one waiting for a spark to ignite open conflict. Commoners bore the weight of taxation and tribute, their frustrations often misdirected toward powerless targets, while the elite maneuvered freely within the halls of influence. The queen, in her youth, was both observer and participant in these dynamics, witnessing small injustices and absorbing lessons in survival, strategy, and the precarious nature of power. These early exposures instilled in her both confidence and hubris, a belief that with enough wit and foresight, she could navigate the complexities of life and death in the castle and beyond. As the queen matured, the castle's walls no longer felt merely protective. They became the arena in which her influence would be tested. She learned to walk the fine line between deference and authority, understanding that every nod, glance, and gesture could ripple through the court with consequences she could not yet fully measure. Tutors had instructed her in history, diplomacy, and the art of persuasion, but they could not impart the more subtle knowledge that human ambition often masked itself in smiles, that alliances were as fragile as spun glass, and that even the most carefully considered plan could unravel in the face of envy, malice, or oversight. Each morning, as she dressed in the ornate gowns and jeweled finery that marked her status, she rehearsed her poise and charm, as though each movement were a strategic decision in a game whose stakes were life and death. The halls were alive with the quiet observations of servants, the subtle nods of allies, and the ever-present glances of those who measured every action for opportunity. Her ambition grew alongside her understanding of court politics. She sought influence in decisions that extended beyond ceremonial appearances, offering counsel to ministers, debating matters of trade and alliance, and inserting herself into discussions that touched the core of the kingdom's governance. Yet in each choice lay the seed of vulnerability, favoring one minister over another, advocating for policies she only partially understood, and attempting to demonstrate both wisdom and decisiveness. She unknowingly drew attention to her own limitations. Courtiers whispered behind her back, noting each overreach and quietly setting the stage for future misinterpretations of intent. To the untrained eye, she appeared competent, even formidable. But in truth, every action contained potential pitfalls that, when compounded over time, would weave a dangerous web around her. Despite the growing complexity of her influence, the queen's naivety persisted in subtle ways. She underestimated the persistence of resentment, overestimated the loyalty of those who smiled in her presence, and misread the motivations of those who seemed to align with her interests. Small favors granted to friends, seemingly harmless decisions made in moments of confidence, and minor oversights in etiquette created invisible fractures in the court's delicate hierarchy. She could not yet see how these cracks would expand, how subtle slights would be magnified into dangerous misunderstandings, and how the trust she assumed she had earned could be weaponized against her. Every decision, though made with intention, carried unseen consequences, and the tapestry of power she was weaving around herself included threads both strong and brittle. In moments of quiet reflection, the Queen occasionally sensed unease, though she could not fully articulate its origin. The castle, once merely a sanctuary, began to feel suffocating, as if its corridors themselves carried the weight of scrutiny. She noticed the faint tensions in conversations, the slight hesitations in expressions, and the calculated pauses that followed her statements. Every smile, bow, or curt nod was measured against her own expectations of loyalty, and yet even her careful calculations could not account for the hidden ambitions swirling around her. The young Queen learned that intuition alone was insufficient. Observation, analysis, and subtle manipulation were required to survive and thrive in a world where ambition was both shield and weapon. Yet, it was not merely external forces that threatened her. Her own pride, though tempered by awareness, often blinded her to the broader implications of her actions. She assumed control where she should have deferred, asserted opinion where silence would have preserved influence, and trusted judgment where caution demanded vigilance. These internal miscalculations, small at first, compounded over months and years, layering a burden of unseen mistakes that would ultimately converge in a single devastating moment. The castle's shadows, filled with whispers and silent witnesses, seemed to watch as she navigated her complex environment, a silent reminder that every decision left its mark upon the tapestry of destiny, and that no step, however calculated, could be taken lightly. Outside the chambers, the court continued its subtle power struggles. Ministers and advisors, though outwardly respectful, often sought opportunities to exploit gaps in her judgment. The alliances she formed, meant to secure her position, were fragile. The favors she granted, intended to inspire loyalty, became subtle instruments of indebtedness that could be manipulated by those with greater cunning. As she observed the movements of courtiers and the ebb and flow of influence, she began to appreciate the intricacy of the court's social mechanics, yet she remained only partially aware of how deeply her own choices had begun to entangle her in a web she could not fully escape. Even her personal interactions were calculated with a blend of ambition and vulnerability. She learned to smile at the right moment, to tilt her head just so, to offer reassurance or authority depending on circumstance. Every step of her day, every gesture, became a rehearsal in control and perception. She could charm or command, yet each interaction carried risk. Misreading a glance, misjudging tone, or misplacing trust could all be disastrous. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her ambition, the same force that drove her forward, planted seeds of downfall, threading through her life like invisible currents that would one day pull her into the earth she could not outrun. In the quiet hours of dawn, when the castle was empty save for the soft murmur of servants and the distant clatter of guards, the Queen sometimes reflected on her choices. Ambition, desire for influence, and youthful confidence had guided her path, yet the realization that each action had consequences too subtle to immediately perceive began to take hold. Her mistakes, small though they seemed, were accumulating, like stones in a hidden pile that would one day form an unyielding weight. The castle, with all its splendor and security, held her as a prisoner not of walls and gates, but of decisions, some made with clarity, others with blind hope, and all inching her closer to a reckoning she could not yet see. Even as the Queen's influence grew and her decisions carved pathways through the labyrinth of courtly intrigue, subtle signs of impending disaster began to emerge. Shadows lengthened in the corridors of the castle as if the very walls were aware of the fate being woven within them. Courtiers and ministers, who had once smiled in deferential agreement, now exchanged glances that hinted at doubt, resentment, and ambition lurking just beneath the surface. Every gesture, every favor, every assertion of authority carried consequences the Queen could not yet perceive, and the intricate web of alliances she had painstakingly constructed began to reveal its fragility. Where she believed her cleverness provided safety, the seeds of betrayal had already taken root, hidden from her sight, but potent enough to shape events she could not control. The kingdom itself seemed to mirror this delicate imbalance. Villagers whispered of injustice and inequity. Minor rebellions flickered in remote provinces, and even the castle's guards, whose loyalty had been assumed, began to hesitate in subtle ways that spoke of doubt and unease. The Queen, still proud and determined, often interpreted these signs through the lens of her ambition, seeing opportunity rather than danger. She remained blind to the subtle patterns forming around her. How small errors compounded, how minor misjudgments multiplied in ways that could one day become catastrophic. The air was thick with tension, almost imperceptible, but ever present, pressing upon every corridor, every chamber, and every mind that moved within the castle. Her personal miscalculations, though seemingly minor, began to interact with external forces in unpredictable ways. A favor granted to one minister might inadvertently provoke the jealousy of another. A seemingly harmless decision regarding courtly protocol could ripple outward, touching the lives of the powerful and the powerless alike. Each of these missteps, when taken in isolation, appeared trivial. Yet when viewed as a pattern, they revealed an emerging inevitability. The Queen's own choices were shaping the very path that would lead her to tragedy. The court, the kingdom, and even the very soil upon which the castle rested seemed poised, as though aware of the coming reckoning, to conspire in delivering her to her fate. In moments of solitude, she sometimes sensed the subtle unease that crept along the edges of her perception. A whisper in the hallway, the sideways glance of a servant, or a hesitation in an advisor's counsel carried weight she did not yet fully grasp. The castle, with all its grandeur and seeming permanence, now appeared to her as a fragile network of human ambition, envy, and subtle manipulation. Each decision she had made, each word spoken with intent or pride, had begun to echo in the quiet spaces, a faint murmur of warning that she was ill-prepared to recognize. The threads of destiny, though invisible, were entwining around her more tightly with each passing day, preparing the stage for events she could neither undo nor foresee. Even as the Queen engaged in her daily duties, the kingdom itself seemed to breathe with a quiet, foreboding rhythm. Markets thrummed with commerce, yet murmurs of discontent rippled beneath the surface. The courtiers moved in patterns that were polite on the surface, but fraught with underlying tension. The ministers who served her so faithfully were slowly plotting, weaving their ambitions into the Queen's own sphere of influence. Each step she took, though deliberate and confident, brought her closer to the precipice she could not yet see. The soil, both literal and metaphorical, was beginning to shift beneath her feet, signaling the approach of a calamity rooted not in rebellion alone, but in the cumulative weight of choices made with both pride and naivety. Foreshadowing of tragedy became inseparable from the Queen's daily existence. Her mistakes, once isolated and seemingly harmless, compounded, interacting with the ambitions, jealousy, and cunning of others in ways that magnified their effect. Every favor granted, every command issued, and every oversight became a thread in a tapestry whose image she could not yet perceive. The court's whispers, the shifting loyalties, and the invisible currents of power all converged into an atmosphere thick with tension, anticipation, and an almost tangible sense of dread. The audience, now fully immersed in her world, can sense the inevitability of the disaster approaching, understanding that the Queen's own decisions have sown the seeds of her downfall. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the castle seemed to hold its breath, the Queen would sometimes pause to reflect, though never fully recognizing the magnitude of the forces aligned against her. Pride and ambition, once her most valuable allies, had begun to show themselves as double-edged tools, shaping a future that would leave her trapped beneath consequences she could neither alter nor escape. Every corridor, every chamber, and every shadow seemed to whisper reminders of the fragility of her position. The choices she made with confidence during the day now appeared in memory with the subtle warning of inevitability and the weight of the unseen consequences pressed upon her, though she did not yet understand its form or magnitude. The stage was set, the characters in place, and the threads of fate interwoven with precision. What had begun as a series of small miscalculations now loomed as a growing inevitability. Every action, every favor, every ambition, however well-intentioned, carried with it a silent judgment, a subtle nudge toward the catastrophe that waited patiently beneath the surface. The castle, the kingdom, and the very air surrounding her had become conspirators in a tragedy that was part human, part destiny, and wholly unavoidable. Even as she moved through her daily life with confidence, the specter of what was to come hovered, unseen yet undeniable, foreshadowing a calamity whose echoes would reverberate through the corridors of history long after her final breath. As the Queen's influence in the castle expanded, so too did the undercurrents of envy, suspicion, and silent rivalry. Courtiers, ministers, and even seemingly loyal advisors began to manipulate situations with subtle cunning, exploiting her miscalculations while cloaking ambition in the language of politeness. Every favor she granted, every alliance she forged, carried hidden consequences that she could not yet perceive. Small errors in judgment, favoring one minister over another, misreading a whispered warning, or showing confidence where caution was demanded, began to ripple through the court like tremors before an earthquake. The castle, once a sanctuary of grandeur and security, now felt alive with quiet menace, as if its walls themselves were aware of the tensions slowly coiling around the Queen. Beyond the walls, the kingdom mirrored the fragility of the court. Rumors of discontent in villages, unrest among minor nobles, and subtle shifts in the loyalty of soldiers suggested that even distant observers sensed instability. The Queen, still proud and determined, interpreted many of these signs as opportunity rather than danger. She pressed forward in her ambitions, believing that intelligence and charm could shield her from consequences. Yet the more she exerted control, the tighter the web of unseen threats drew around her, as minor oversights compounded and miscalculations layered into a complex structure of vulnerability. Every day, the castle's corridors grew heavier with whispers, the walls thick with the silent plotting of those who saw her rise as an opportunity to advance their own agendas. And every decision she made in good faith edged her closer to calamity. By now, the threads of fate had intertwined in a way that could no longer be untangled. Her earlier mistakes, small at first, almost imperceptible, had compounded, leaving her exposed to the ambitions and resentments of those she trusted most. Advisors who once offered guidance now concealed their motives, each interaction a potential trap. The young Queen, though perceptive, had not fully understood the fragility of her position. Her pride and naivety blinded her to the looming consequences. What she perceived as minor courtly disputes were in fact the early stages of a storm she could neither predict nor escape. The tension reached a palpable crescendo as the Queen walked the halls of the castle, observing subtle signs of unrest, yet failing to see the full picture. Ministers exchanged coded glances, servants whispered in corners, and even the guards, bound by loyalty, carried the weight of indecision. Every favor she had granted, every policy she had endorsed, every alliance she had chosen carefully, now converged into an invisible pressure that bore down upon her. The audience senses the inevitability. The young Queen, ambitious yet vulnerable, is moving steadily toward the moment that will define her life and death. The stage is set. The actors, poised, and the silent forces she cannot see tighten their grip. The soil beneath her metaphorical feet, once supportive, now threatening, prepares to receive the weight of a destiny shaped by choices, misjudgments, and ambition, leaving all who witness this tension aching with suspense and anticipation for the tragedy that will follow. The castle seemed to hold its breath as the Queen, once confident in her influence and judgment, confronted the consequences of her choices. Each corridor she traversed echoed with the silent scrutiny of those who had watched her rise, their intentions no longer hidden behind polite smiles. Courtiers, ministers, and even servants had woven a lattice of subtle manipulations, and now every thread pulled taut, leaving her vulnerable in ways she could not anticipate. Her earlier decisions, granted with ambition and pride, now converged into a force she could neither negotiate nor evade. The crown she bore felt heavier than ever, not from the weight of gold, but from the suffocating pressure of inevitable judgment. Every glance from an advisor, every hesitation from a servant, every whisper of movement carried with it a message she could no longer ignore. The tide had turned, and her missteps had summoned a calamity far greater than she could have imagined. As she was guided toward the chamber that would seal her fate, the Queen's heart raced with a mix of fear, disbelief, and an agonizing understanding of her own role in the unfolding tragedy. The shadows of the castle seemed to lengthen and twist, painting the walls with dark reflections of choices and errors long forgotten. There was no escape, no opportunity to undo the past. Each step forward was a surrender to the inevitability she had unknowingly courted. She could feel the cold stone beneath her feet, hear the distant creak of the castle's heavy doors, and sense the silent anticipation of the kingdom's most powerful and watchful eyes. The air itself seemed laden with judgment, each breath a reminder that ambition, unchecked by humility or foresight, had drawn her into a snare crafted not only by others, but by the very decisions she had made herself. The moment of reckoning arrived with the slow inevitability of nightfall. As the Queen was confined, the darkness pressed close, and the realization of her mortality, once an abstract concept taught in history lessons, became a suffocating, visceral reality. Her own choices, her pride, and her naivety had delivered her to this chamber where shadows danced upon cold stone walls and the air hung thick with silent accusation. The ritual of her demise, though executed with calculated precision, was suffused with the weight of poetic justice. It was not rebellion, nor a foreign enemy that condemned her, but the accumulation of errors, misjudgments, and ambition unchecked. In that silence, she faced the starkest truth of all. The architect of her downfall had been herself, and every attempt to manipulate or control her environment had only tightened the grip of the destiny she had summoned. Even in her final moments, the Queen's mind raced with the images of her past choices, each one a thread in the tapestry of her undoing. She understood too late how small oversights, misplaced trust, and the subtle betrayals she had ignored had created the mechanism of her demise. The darkness was complete, and yet within that darkness, a flicker of reflection persisted. The knowledge that ambition without wisdom, confidence without caution, and power without insight could destroy even the most favored and protected among them. As the cold soil and shadow enveloped her, the audience is left with the haunting image of a queen, undone not by fate alone, but by the interplay of human flaws, ambition, and the silent, patient forces that watch every choice unfold. The climax leaves a lingering question. In a world where ambition and pride shape destiny, who among us is truly safe from the consequences of our own actions? The castle, once vibrant with the echoes of ambition, strategy, and whispered secrets, now seemed hollow, its corridors heavy with silence. Courtiers moved cautiously, their expressions a blend of fear, awe, and the unspoken recognition that the Queen's fall had been as inevitable as it was tragic. Her chambers, stripped of life and ornament, reflected the emptiness left behind, not merely in stone and drapery, but in the void of influence and authority she had once commanded. Outside, the kingdom continued its rhythm, unaware of the full depth of the lesson etched into its walls. Yet for those who had watched her rise and fall, the Queen's demise became a mirror, reflecting the cost of ambition untethered from wisdom, of pride untempered by foresight, and of power sought without understanding the currents that shape the hearts and intentions of others. The story of her choices, her miscalculations, and her ultimate tragedy spread quietly at first, carried in whispered recountings among courtiers and ministers. These tales, embroidered by memory and imagination, emphasized that her downfall had been neither random nor sudden, but the inevitable conclusion of decisions made with both audacity and naivety. Those who had opposed her, manipulated her, or watched silently now bore witness to the truth that human ambition is a force capable of both creation and destruction, and that the consequences of one's actions, however subtle at first, can grow until they dominate every path before us. The Queen's fate became a cautionary emblem, a reminder that power, privilege, and opportunity are inseparable from responsibility, perception, and the often unseen forces that shape destiny. Even after her passing, the echoes of the Queen's life lingered in the castle, the kingdom, and the collective memory of those who observed her journey. Portraits, now somber in tone, depicted her with eyes that seemed to carry both pride and sorrow, a silent testament to the brilliance and hubris that had defined her existence. Scholars, scribes, and storytellers chronicled the tale, framing it as both historical record and moral parable. Ambition without insight, influence without humility, and choices made without reflection can summon a fate that no cunning, charm, or authority can escape. The audience, witnessing the aftermath, is left with the chilling realization that the darkest tragedies often spring from within, that our greatest enemies can be the decisions we ourselves make, and that destiny may reward or punish with impartial inevitability. As the kingdom moved forward, rebuilding trust, alliances, and governance, the story of the Queen endured, not merely as a tale of death, but as a reflection on human frailty, the mechanics of power, and the invisible threads that connect action to consequence. The cold stone corridors, the whispering servants, and the silent halls of authority all became monuments to a life lived at the intersection of ambition and error. And as the audience contemplates the layers of her story, one question lingers, like a shadow over the kingdom and across time. In a world ruled by choices, alliances, and unseen forces, can anyone truly escape the consequences of the paths they forge?